What's up, Internet? SB here for the Marduk report, and today we are talking about the Jonsbo A4 ITX case. So I know that there are a lot of cases like this on the market, but let's take a look to see what Jonsbo is doing different with this form factor. So like I said, this is an ITX case, the kind of shoebox on its side design with a split chamber. I'll put some dimensions in here. So this case comes in at about 15.8 liters, which is small, but not super ultra compact. You're still gonna be able to fit a full-size graphics card in here. You're still gonna be able to fit a 240mm AIO, which actually I highly recommend if you do get this case. 2 SSDs, and then however many M.2s you can fit on your motherboard. In terms of the actual case, I really like how clean and minimal it is, and I know like other cases, NR200, Dan A4, Lock Ghost S1, other cases like that, they are all of a very similar, sleek, minimal design. But I think where this Jonsbo A4 is a bit different is that the fact that it has both side panels are tempered glass, and it has a really unusual pattern on the top plate. So instead of being hexagons or circles or anything like that, you've got this interesting Tetris L pattern, which I haven't really seen before, and it is nice and it's different. All the material is aluminum, with the center spine being steel, obviously tempered glass on the sides. The only plastic on this case are the 2 fan filters that are both 120mm on the bottom. A little note on the presentation of this case, it's a really nice to have. It doesn't really make a difference to the case at all, but the fact that nearly all of the screws, instead of coming in just a baggie thrown in a box or slid into a drive tray, they actually all come screwed into this acrylic panel that is then mounted where an SSD would go. And that's just super nice. The only screws that don't come in that panel are the 4 screws that hold in the case feet. The tempered glass side windows, I really like it. There's no hardware that holds it in. Everything it's completely flush mount, which is beautiful when it comes to the actual presentation. However, that actually poses a slight issue with the side panels and getting into the case. Because there's no hardware to get into the case, in order to actually open it up, you've got to slide the top panel back, pop that off, and then basically squeeze the side panels and lift up to get into the case, which doesn't really sound that bad. If you're like me and most people who have ever built a PC, you've gone through the entire process of putting the whole thing together, only to then go to power it on, and it doesn't turn on. Why? Because you forgot to flip the power switch. Normally, it's pretty easy because you just reach around to the back, flip the switch, and you're good to go. With this case, the power supply is fully enclosed in the front of the case. So those cool tempered side glass panels are now kind of going to be an issue because you got to take the top off and then squeeze down on the right-hand side panel, lift that up, and then reach in with your maybe only like 1 finger, maybe 2 if you're lucky, and actually flip the switch and then put everything back together. So looks cool, but at the same time, it can be kind of a bit fiddly. And I think that's really the story of this whole case, is that it's a lot of cool looking stuff, but some things are a bit fiddly. The tempered glass panels are also incredibly dark. It's just a thing that Jonsbo does. I guess that's what they like, but note that if you want to get this case and you want to be able to show off your components, you're going to need some really bright LEDs, like really bright. Just like how it's unusual to get into this case, another thing that's really unusual about what's in this case, or actually what's not in this case, are rivets. And I know that's not something that everyone really cares about, but if you are even remotely thinking about modding this case, the fact that the entire thing is held together with screws is a godsend. There's no drilling out of any rivets. You can just pull the whole thing apart, lay it all flat, and do whatever you need to do, and then put it all back together again. All the screws are Phillips except for 3. There are 2 on the back and 1 on the inside that hold the spine into the front and rear panels. Getting into the actual internals of the case, the entire tray that would hold a radiator on the top of the case is removable. So once you slide off the top panel, you're then presented with another panel which has 8 screws in it. There are 2 in each corner, 4 on the top, and then come down perpendicular 90 degrees, and there's a screw in each corner. I'm a little concerned about how close these screws are to the finished aluminum side panels. Because of the front and rear panels aren't actually just perfectly square, there's a slight curve to them so that they meet the tempered glass side panels. And the screws to get off the radiator mount are really, really close. It's close enough that my screwdriver didn't really want to fit. So take that for what it's worth. You could pretty easily scratch this also, because aluminum is not a very durable material. The power supply and the SSDs are all mounted onto one cage that sits in the front right portion of the case. And then there is an extension cable along the inside of the case that runs to the rear of the case so that you can actually have power in the back. This power supply and SSD cage is actually removable, and you should remove it if you're going to build in this case. There are 7 screws that hold it in. It's just unscrew, pull out, mount all your hardware into it, and put it back in. I would suggest that you also go ahead and route all of your cables out of your power supply at this point as well. For I/O, it's a really simple I/O on this. There's a power button, there's a USB 3.1 Gen 1 and a 3.2 Gen 2 Type-C port, and that's it. That's what you get on the front. There's nothing else on the sides. I have seen a couple of reviews where people have been saying that their case did not come with the riser cable. This case does, and this is version 1.1. The quickest way to tell if you're getting version 1 or version 1.1 is the Type-C port in the front. If it doesn't have the Type-C port, that's version 1. Don't want to buy that. What you want to make sure that you're getting is version 1.1. That will have the Type-C port on the front, and it comes with the riser cable. I do like that the riser cable is actually reinforced, I guess, along part of the section of it. And that's because it has to bend around the spine at a pretty hard angle. And I know riser cables aren't really meant to bend like this, so I'm glad to see that this riser cable is actually reinforced. There are 3 actual colors that go with this case. This is supposed to be the dark gray. That doesn't look dark gray to me. I'm sure it doesn't look dark gray to you either. This is silver, but there's supposed to be a dark gray and a black, all the same price. So if one of those colors strikes your fancy more than this, know that you can get it in other colors. So like I detailed before, once you're actually ready to start building, you're going to want to take off all of the panels, or at least as many of them as possible. So that means taking off the top panel, taking out the tempered glass side panels, and then going ahead and removing the AIO radiator bracket. And once you've done that, you're kind of left with this open-ended, open-sided box that is ready for actual building. In my build, I decided I would tackle the power supply and the SSDs first. The 2 acrylic, we'll call them cards for right now, that held most of the screws for the case. They're a little snug, so I had to definitely get out a screwdriver to loosen those up so I could pop those off, but they are supposedly toolless once you actually get them back onto your SSD. And again, like I was saying with the presentation, this is another thing that I really like. Instead of putting these rubber grommets in a bag or in something else, they're actually attached to these acrylic cards that are the size of SSDs, so you actually have to take them off of the cards and then put them on the SSDs that you plan on using. Getting the power supply to actually fit properly into the power supply bracket, not really that big a problem, but you do have to note that it is not actually flat. There is a space between the power supply and the power supply bracket, and that is to allow for the screws on the SSDs some clearance. Once I had my power supply all into the bracket, it was time to put on the SSDs, and this is when I got to the first gripe of this case. When installing the SSDs, I had them ready to go, snapped them in, and they looked great. And then I realized that because of where the wires come out for the power supply, my SSDs actually need to be mounted upside down so that the SATA power can actually reach the SSDs. There's not enough space if you have your SSD drives facing upright so that the ports are on the left side. There's not enough space between the front of the case and where the bracket ends to actually get the cables plugged in. So you have to mount your SSDs upside down in order to actually be able to plug in any kind of power into them, which is super annoying. I wish that the front of this power supply bracket had a bit of a cutout so that you could route power from the power supply to the SSDs on the left side so that your SSDs can be upright, and also move those cables out of the way, because as we'll see later when I get to actually doing the cable management, you need every millimeter you can get. While you have this entire power supply SSD bracket out, you're going to want to also go ahead and wire up your power supply now, because if you try to do it later, you're going to be in a world of hurt. That is, unless you've got really tiny hands, then by all means, do whenever you feel like it. Also, if you can, I highly recommend getting custom power supply cables for this case, because anytime you can cut down on either excess cable length or just excess connectors just get rid of them, definitely do it. The EVGA power supply that I'm using has 3 SATA power ports to 1 cable, so you can power 3 SATA devices, but in this case, you really only need 2, and that's for 2 SSD. And so you've got an extra third one just kind of hanging about that. Yes, you can try to cable manage and tie down, but like I said, you need every millimeter inside of this case. I know I said it before, but just to reiterate, the case feet are magnetic, but you're going to want to put the screws in as well. If you don't, these case feet will come off. After getting the entire power supply unit together, put it back in the case. And again, it's the same 7 screws you pulled out, just put them right back in, good to go. So at this point, I decided it was time to tackle the motherboard. Had everything plugged up, had the CPU in, had the RAM in, had the NVMe drives in, and was starting to put on the bracket needed for the AIO, that Inwin SR24. I went and put the motherboard into the case and then put the SR24 in to make sure it was going to line up, and that is when I noticed my second problem. And this isn't an issue with the case, this is more an issue that I had. The Inwin SR24, the actual AIO, the pump reservoir cooler part, is too tall for this case. Yeah. Didn't think about that, and now I was stuck with an AIO that was too tall to fit. This dual turbine cooler thing is 100 millimeters tall, and it's too tall for this case. The clearance on this case is exactly 71 millimeters for your CPU cooler. It wasn't even like, oh, I could just squish it in. Not happening. So had to pull out the riser cable, at least from the GPU end, and then pull out the bracket and install a new AIO. And this is a Cooler Master ML240. So that's the Master Liquid 240, which has a reservoir pump height of only 50 millimeters, which fits in just fine. So with the proper cooler now ready to go, time to tackle the GPU. Install the riser cable, and again, like I said, that area that's reinforced, really nice, because you're gonna have to bend this pretty hard in order to get it around the spine of the case. PCIe slot cover is probably the only time you actually need to use the included Allen key, unless you plan on modding this. So there is a Allen screw on the inside back panel of the case that you undo to take out these PCIe covers. And then this is my other gripe, because it isn't in the instruction manual anywhere. When you try to take this cover off after taking that screw off, it still doesn't come off. It wasn't until after really looking at the case and kind of moving it around that I realized there are 2 more screws in the actual cover from the PCIe bracket covers. So you have to basically flip the case on its front and then look underneath to see 2 more screws that are holding in that bracket cover and the actual slot covers. Take those 2 out, and then you're ready to install your GPU. So with the graphics card installed, I ran the power cables for it from the power supply in the channel between the power supply and the motherboard and up and over the spine. And I came into yet another issue. If you do that, there's not going to be enough clearance for fans and a radiator on top. Your PCIe power cables, so for your graphics card, are going to hit your fans. So what you want to do instead, there is a small cutout right next to the power supply where all your wires will come out, right next to that rubber grommet. There's a small cutout in the spine. You're going to want to put the PCIe power cables through that and then wire them up straight behind your graphics card on the other side. And then use the very top of the spine, because it is actually curved, there's a lip. Push the cables down and tuck them into that lip. I know it's not ideal, but it's really the only way you're going to get those cables in there for your graphics card and have them not hit your fan. And let me tell you, this clearance is super tight. You'll also notice that there are 2 notches, one in the spine and then one in the power supply bracket. And you would think you would use those 2 notches at the top to run your cables through. Don't do that. I thought that's what you should do as well. That's not what they're for. They're literally there so that you can run your AIO tubing. Your AIO is really only going to fit in one direction, with the inlet outlet from the radiator to your actual pump in the front of the case. There's not enough space at the back to do that, so there's only one way to put in an AIO in this case. With the AIO actually mounted back into the case, it is now time to do the hardest part of this case, which is cable management. Because this case is so small, there's nowhere to actually manage cable. There's no tie downs, there's no nothing. And if you're going to actually do a fully loaded build out like this with 2 SSDs, you are probably in a world of trouble. Honestly, I think a case like this is a great use for fans like the new Lian Li ones, the Uni SL 120s, the ones that don't have any cables to them and they just connect to each other. This is the kind of case that you want to use them for, where every millimeter is going to count for your cables. For me, the only actual place I found that I could route cables was in that channel that sits between the power supply and the motherboard. Everything had to get put there. And man, let me tell you, it's tight. Also note that you can do 2 more 120 millimeter fans mounted at the bottom of this case, which probably will help with temperature, but that's going to take up a lot of the space that you're going to need for cable routing. Pro tip when working on this part of the build, take out the fan filters out the bottom so that you can reach your hands through the openings in order to actually reach any kind of cables or plug anything into your motherboard. Another pro tip when doing the cable management in this case, as you can see, I took the RAM back out because the RAM was in the way of me actually being able to reach and plug cables in. So if you're having problems with actually being able to reach where connectors go, take your RAM back out, plug in all your cables, and then put the RAM back in. And then we came to another issue. Because there is no cable management in this case, this is what I was afraid of with a fully loaded build like this, is that once I got everything put together, all the actual cables are going to be sticking out the side. There's really only a few millimeters of clearance between the glass panel and all the stuff inside this build. So you're going to have to do a lot of squishing of cables like I did. Oh, and don't forget, once you actually put your power supply unit back into the case, don't forget to plug in the power extension while you're doing this before you move on to anything else. It's the last thing you want to have to go and do later. In what would be called as a head-scratching moment, the filter that goes on the top panel is included with the case, but is not installed, and it doesn't really make sense. So it's a pretty fine mesh filter with 3M tape already installed on the filter, but then you still have to peel off the backing to the tape and stick it onto the top panel. I don't really know why it's just not already installed. I don't know like what that saves the company, but you gotta do it yourself. And if you are gonna use this filter, I recommend pulling up at least a few of these screws with the rubber grommets so that you can slide the filter just underneath them. With that installed, you can finally actually put that top panel back on and actually start using your new build, or so I thought. There's a sticker on the top of the case, tells you how to open the case. The panel only fits in one direction. Even though it looks unidirectional, like you can put it either front or back, that sticker is on the back of the panel. So in order to get the case panel to fit, make sure that sticker is at the back of the case, or else it just won't fit. It's going to be off by a little bit, but it won't actually fit on. Once you get all the cables tucked in and that glass panel on that side actually locked in place, it's finally time for one of the best parts. Once I got the build done, I was actually really concerned about the GPU because it sits so close to the tempered glass. There's only about one PCI slot's worth of space between it and the glass. I was really concerned that this glass was going to be choking this GPU. Unfortunately, I was right. Throughout all my testing, I consistently saw better performance, lower temperatures with the panel removed. And I did all of my tests 3 times back to back with and without the panel just to make sure, and every single time I was seeing lower temps, higher frame rates, and the higher scores without the glass panel. So the scores for my testing aren't really what matters. What matters here is actually the difference in the scores between running these tests with the panel on and with the panel off. I started off with TimeSpy here because TimeSpy had the biggest difference in the GPU's temperature range. Without the panel, I was seeing roughly about 72 degrees Celsius, and as soon as I put that panel back on, temperature shot up to 78, 79 degrees. In Firestrike, it was a bit more on par with what I saw throughout the rest of my testing. With the panel off, I was seeing about 74 degrees Celsius, and with the panel on, going right back up to 78. Same thing with Rise of the Tomb Raider, running the benchmark. With the panel on, I was seeing about 63 frames per second, and the temperatures were right at 79 degrees. As soon as I took the panel off, frames jumped up to about 66 frames per second, and my temperatures dropped down to 74 degrees. So the difference in the temperatures isn't huge, but it is noticeable, and it is definitely very consistent with having the panel off versus having the panel on. I think that the noise and the heat problem of the GPU could be mitigated in this case if you were to use one of those DIY AIO solutions from either SwiftTech, which I'm not sure if would fit, or the Barrow solution. That's the pump, reservoir, and CPU block all in one, and making a custom loop with that and a 240 mil rad on the top. If you're going to go the route of the Barrow unit, just make sure you're getting the Barrow one and not the Barrow CH one, or Barrow Shi. I'm not really sure of how you pronounce it, but the Barrow CH one is the one that has the display on the pump, and that's actually going to be too tall to fit in this case by about 2.5 millimeters. That's 73.5 millimeters tall. Again, this case has a CPU cooler height limit of 71 millimeters. The regular Barrow unit is 68, so it will fit. I do think that the temperatures of the GPU and even the CPU could be better with more fans installed on the bottom, because remember, this case can support an extra two 120 millimeter fans at the bottom of the case. So having a completely vertical airflow would help. It'd probably make this case even louder. So I don't know if I really would want to do that. Plus, if you have 4 fans in this case, where are you plugging them into? I don't know of any ITX boards that can support 4 fans at once without some kind of fan hub or fan splitter. And if you're going to use some kind of fan hub, there's not really a lot of space for it. It either have to be in the very back on the top or on the front on the GPU side, and that'd still be pretty tight. So I don't know if a fan hub would actually even work. This case, man. The Jonsbo A4 is a great case. I really like the design of it. I really like the fit and finish of all of it. But if I have to give this thing an actual rating, this gets a Marduk report rating of find it on sale. I want to give it a rating of purchase. Like, look at it. Like, it's an amazing looking case. But between GPU temperature issues and cable management issues, and the fact that it's $230, I don't know if I mentioned this before, 230 bucks, which is on par for other cases like this, like the Dan A4 and the Ghost S1. It's on par for that, but that's still a lot of money. If this case were coming in at just the retail price and you weren't paying the incredibly high shipping from China, I would totally give this a rating of purchase. Just for clarification, the actual price of this case without crazy shipping is like 130 bucks. And at that price, it's amazing, and I would deal with all the problems. But at 230, it makes it really hard to justify. So if you're willing to put up with the cable management and you're going to do a custom loop in this, by all means, go for it. It's an amazing case. But this has been it for the Jonsbo A4. Let me know what you think. Do you agree that it is overpriced? Do you think that it's actually a good value? If you're going to get this case, would you do a build similar to this, or would you do a custom loop? Or if you're even considering this case and you think that you'd get something else, what would you get? Let me know down below, and try to enjoy the rest of the year and be safe, because I want to see you again. Peace.